President Trump heading to China later today, as we mentioned, seeking Chinese action to rebalance trade with the U.S. and also increase pressure on North Korea. Both presidents will then travel to Vietnam and the Philippines for regional summits, the APEC summit, where they're going to vie for support among wavering leaders. Let's get more perspective with the former U.S. Trade Representative Ron Kirk joining us now from Washington. Ron, thank you so much for joining us. President Trump left Washington with promises of being tough, of getting tough and staying tough on trade with Japan and also particularly China, saying he's going to be looking at very strong actions in his words. Do you think he can deliver that?
Well, we don't know. It's been a bit of a challenge for us in the U.S. to try to match the president's sort of Twitter policy with the administration's policy. But there is great concern among a number of U.S. businesses over how we will rebalance our economic relationships in Asia, and particularly with China and Japan, the other members of the Trans-Pacific Partnership that the Trump administration has now abandoned.
Right. It certainly seems like, the rhetoric, particularly we saw not just on Twitter, Ron, but of course during the campaign, right? It's so different than what the reality is right now. You mentioned CEOs, what they would like out of this. They're going to be traveling with the president in China, meeting with officials as well. What do you think U.S. businesses, what would help U.S. businesses in the trade imbalance?
Well, listen, I understand the rhetoric. And in fairness, to President Trump, I mean, the rhetoric in the Democratic primary wasn't that much better. I mean, I am one of those unicorns of a pro-trade Democrat. But what I do know is, from my time serving as U.S. trade rep, it is not in the U.S. long-term economic interest to disengage from a world in which 95% of consumers now live somewhere other than the U.S. And that's one of the rationales behind our moving forward and being a part of the 12-member nation that seek to build and craft the most forward-looking trade agreement ever accomplished through the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And more importantly, that isn't just good for U.S. business. That's good for U.S. consumers. It's good for U.S. workers, because we have to compete for the hearts and wallets of these new consumers who are coming of age, and nowhere more so than in this fast-growing, dynamic region of Southeast Asia.
Ron, I want to throw up a quick chart that I think goes to really the heart of these campaign promises that the president made, and also goes to the heart of his supporter base, right, which is these trade deficits with major Asian trading partners. We saw that with that $70 billion deficit in Japan, he went out hard and said, we need to fix this. He wants to renegotiate the terms of trade. That terms of trade are not fair. They're not open. In China, they're in the red, about $350 billion. That's going to be at the core of what he wants to address with Beijing, right? But we saw Taro Aso coming out into Japan after he left, saying, no, we're not going to renegotiate or negotiate trade deals based on the premise of reducing the trade deficit with the United States. So is this kind of, a tactic that just isn't going to work in negotiations?
Well, I don't believe it isn't. And I think it's grossly simplistic to sell a notion to any constituency that all deficits are bad. As we know, some of those trade deficits are us buying inputs that are critical to our making goods here in the United States. And I have to tell you, many of us were frankly embarrassed for the president when he challenged the Japanese to think about making cars in the United States, when you've had everyone from Toyota and Hyundai and Kia and BMW that have been manufacturing cars in the United States for over 40 years now. So one, I think it's time for us to bring a more reasoned look at this and not look at just the issue of exports all being good and ports being bad, but look at the reality of how we can help grow our economy. We can help create the jobs the president should be looking to create here in the United States by extending our economic partnerships around the world. And the reality is the most efficient, thoughtful way to do that is by progressive trade policies that embody U.S. values, but also lower barriers to entry to these new economies. And that's what we have worked so hard to achieve during the Obama administration. And I think, and I'm still hopeful at some point, that the American business community, the U.S. Chamber and others will help convince the president that one way to fulfill that commitment he made to bring jobs back to America is by deploying a smart, thoughtful, progressive trade policy.
And I suppose the other thing worth pointing out is that that headline deficit number doesn't take into account things like services, right, which is a major component. But do you think with this trip, given that he's got this U.S. delegation, market access is really going to be, you know, the bigger issue here?
You know, it's hard to say because, again, if the president sticks to script, and thus far it does seem he has been somewhat more restrained in his comment. I know the issue of security on the Korean Peninsula is going to be paramount to others. I'm sure there will be some rhetoric about balancing the trade deficit, but I just think that is a dangerous way to approach this issue of trade. And look, there are a number of areas where we have had challenges with China embracing its responsibility now as a global trade leader to open up their economy as aggressively as they have embraced taking advantage of the export part of this trade equation. And I hope that will be a part of the conversation as well, because one of the ways you can attack that deficit is for China to open up much more of its economy, much in the same way that the United States and Europe have.
Right, Ron, it certainly makes a lot of sense, and of course, it's you know, convincing the Chinese to do that. You know, they have many reasons why they wouldn't. Now, you know, despite these tensions and despite these disagreements in areas where they're very far apart still, do you think that the threat of a trade war between the two countries is non-existent anymore, right? Because we really thought at some point we might be on a brink of a trade war with China, particularly just 6-7 months ago. Do you think that threat is over?
It's hard, you know, again, and I hope I don't sound evasive. It's very hard to make those kind of pronouncements when it comes to a president that seems to be motivated by whatever he might see or that might offend him on the evening news the next day. But I do know, and historically we know, that these type of trade wars have never ended well for the participants or for the rest of the world. And the reality is the two of the most dynamic economies in the world that can help not only lift up their own citizens, but all citizens around the world are the United States and China. Now, we can get there by threats and throwing, you know, slings and arrows at one another, or we can continue to engage China in a thoughtful, honest conversation that with their plans for growth, we can help them get there. And by opening up more of their economy for investment, opening up more of their economy for U.S. exports, we help them achieve their own goals to continue to move people from an agrarian lifestyle to a more modern lifestyle. And that would have the same effect of beginning to rebalance the trade flows between the two countries. But I think anytime we can do that in a collaborative way, it's going to be much more productive by just loose threats made for political theater.
Ron, just quickly, what do you think about his approach of conflating security with trade, saying, you know, Beijing, you do something to help us with North Korea and we'll give you something when it comes to trade?
Well, one thing I've learned from working with the Chinese, they are very thoughtful, very deliberate, very studied, and they're least likely to respond, first of all, to any sort of public threats made in the media. The issue of security on the Korean Peninsula is too important, I think, to try to negotiate that in such a loose manner, and hopefully at least from everything I've read. The good thing is there have been open communications between the Trump administration and that of President Xi, and hopefully that will continue. I know our partners in South Korea are hoping for that, because that is the one area where I think the two countries can find comedy.